The object was flying at a tremendous speed, a round, disc-like form of a shining, silvery color. It was flying horizontally, periodically disappearing in the clouds.
Okay, before we say anything else, I need you to understand what you just heard. That is not a tweet from a UFO enthusiast. That is not a campfire story. That is an official report filed with a government agency. And the reason it matters is not just what it describes, it's when it was written. We are going to get to that, but first, sit with that description for a second. Round, disc-like, shining, silvery, flying at tremendous speed, disappearing into clouds. Does that sound familiar?
It should. That description is from a witness account documented in a CIA information report, and nearly identical language appears in hundreds of reports filed across 7 decades. Same shape, same speed, same behavior. The consistency across time and across witnesses who could not possibly have compared notes is one of the most significant and most overlooked features of this entire phenomenon.
And that's exactly what this series is about. Not the theories, not the speculation. The documents, what governments actually wrote down, classified and filed away. Welcome to UFO Files. I'm Reeve.
And I am Echo. We start today where the official record starts, the summer of 1947. And by the end of this episode, you will understand not just when this began, but how seriously the people in charge took it from the very first day.
Here's the question driving this episode. When did this all begin, and how seriously did the government take it from day one? Because the story you've probably heard is that UFOs are a fringe thing. Tabloids, cranks, people who want to believe. But the documents tell a completely different story. Behind closed doors, the response was immediate. It was intense, and it started at the very top of the national security apparatus. To help us understand what that actually looked like, not in theory, but from the cockpit, I want to bring in our guest today.
He spent 22 years flying Navy combat aircraft. He has logged thousands of hours in high-performance jets. He has also spent the last decade reviewing declassified military aviation reports as part of an independent research group focused on aerial phenomena. His name is Malone, and he is exactly the right person to help us understand what pilots were seeing, what they reported, and what the institutional response to those reports actually meant.
Malone, welcome. Let me start with a simple question that probably doesn't have a simple answer. When you first heard descriptions like the one Echo just read, round, disc-like, tremendous speed, disappearing into clouds, what was your reaction as a pilot?
My first reaction, honestly, was recognition. Not because I'd seen the same thing, but because I know exactly what a trained aviator sounds like when they're describing something they cannot explain. There's a specific quality to those reports. No drama, no embellishment, just the observable facts in the order they happened. That description Echo read? That reads like a military pilot's incident report. The person who wrote it was trying to be accurate. And the detail that stands out to me is the speed. Trained observers don't throw around tremendous speed lightly. That's a professional saying. This was outside the performance envelope of anything I know.
So when you see that language in an official document, you read it differently than a civilian might.
Completely differently. Civilians sometimes think pilots are prone to exaggeration. The opposite is true. We are trained to underreport rather than overreport. If a pilot writes tremendous speed, the actual speed was probably beyond tremendous. The professional instinct is to stay conservative, stay credible. So when you see strong language in an official aviation report, that's not the pilot getting excited. That's the pilot struggling to find accurate language for something that doesn't fit any known category.
And that tension between what trained observers were reporting and what the official apparatus could explain is precisely what this episode is about. By the end of this hour, you will understand 3 things. First, how the 1947 wave of sightings established the physical description of the phenomenon that has persisted for 75 years. Second, how the government's internal response contradicted its public posture from the very beginning. And third, and this is the part that still surprises people, how quickly the investigation moved from passive observation to something considerably more active.
That third one is the thing I keep coming back to. Because the public narrative about 1947 is essentially, people saw some weird stuff, the government said it was weather balloons, and everyone moved on. But that is not what the documents show, not even close. So let's set the scene. Echo, take us back.
It is June of 1947. The Second World War has been over for less than 2 years. The United States has just emerged as the most powerful military force on Earth. The Cold War is beginning. The Soviet Union detonated its first nuclear weapon just 2 years away in 1949, and American military planners are acutely aware that the next technological surprise could be catastrophic. Every unidentified aircraft in American airspace carries a very specific potential threat. It could be Soviet. That context is not background. It is everything. It explains the urgency of what follows.
So the country is essentially on high alert for exactly the kind of thing that would look like an unidentified, high-performance aircraft.
That's exactly right. And you have to understand the state of aviation in 1947. The jet age is just beginning. The Bell X-1, Chuck Yeager's aircraft, the one that broke the sound barrier, didn't fly until October of that year. So the performance envelope that military aviators understood as possible was genuinely limited. When pilots started reporting objects that appeared to violate that envelope, objects moving at speeds and executing maneuvers that no known aircraft could perform, the immediate military concern wasn't, is this extraterrestrial? It was, is this Soviet? That's the lens everything gets filtered through.
And then, on June 24, 1947, a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold was flying near Mount Rainier in Washington state. He reported seeing 9 objects flying in formation at what he estimated to be over 1,200 miles per hour, faster than any aircraft known to exist at the time. His description of their movement, skipping like saucers across water, gave birth to the term flying saucer. That phrase entered the American vocabulary overnight, and within days, reports started flooding in from across the country.
Now, Kenneth Arnold is the name most people know. He's kind of the origin point of the modern UFO era. But here's what I find interesting. Arnold wasn't a crank. He wasn't some guy who wanted to believe. He was a businessman and a search and rescue pilot. He had a commercial reason to be in the air that day. He reported what he saw because he thought it was his duty to report it. And his reward for that was decades of public ridicule.
That pattern, credible observer reports something anomalous, gets dismissed publicly, is something I've seen repeated throughout the history of military aviation encounters. And it has a real effect on reporting. Pilots learn very quickly that filing an anomalous sighting report is a career risk. You don't get promoted for seeing things that don't exist. So you start to see this gap open up between what pilots actually observed and what made it into the official record. The reports that did get filed? Those represent a fraction of what was actually seen.
That's a crucial point, and we're going to come back to it. But let's stay in 1947 for a moment, because the Arnold sighting wasn't an isolated event. It was the opening of a floodgate.
In the weeks following Arnold's report, the Army Air Forces, the Air Force did not become a separate branch until September of that year, began receiving reports from pilots, military personnel, and civilians across the United States and internationally. The descriptions were strikingly consistent: round or disc-shaped objects, metallic or silvery appearance, high speed, silent or near-silent operation, and flight characteristics that did not match any known aircraft. The volume and consistency of these reports triggered an official response at the highest levels of the military establishment.
And this is where the public story and the classified story start to diverge. Because publicly, the message was, don't worry about it. Probably weather phenomena, mass hysteria, people seeing things. But behind closed doors,
the reaction was the opposite of dismissive. I've read a lot of internal military communications from this period, and the tone is urgent. These are not bureaucrats humoring the public. These are senior officers genuinely trying to figure out what is operating in American airspace that they cannot identify, cannot intercept, and cannot explain. The gap between the public posture and the classified posture in 1947 is one of the most striking things about this entire history.
By the end of July 1947, the Army Air Forces had formally tasked the Air Materiel Command at Wright Field, which later became Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, with collecting and analyzing all available information on the flying disc reports. That tasking is significant. Wright Field was where the United States kept its most advanced aerospace technology and its best aeronautical engineers. Sending the UFO question, there was not a public relations move. It was a technical intelligence assignment.
So they're treating it like a foreign technology problem. Like someone has built something we don't understand, and we need our best engineers to figure out what it is.
That's the right framework. And it's worth noting that this is actually the correct professional response to unknown aerial phenomena operating in your airspace. You don't start by assuming it's supernatural. You start by asking, what is the performance data? What are the physical characteristics? And does this match anything in our intelligence files on adversary technology? The fact that they sent it to Wright Field tells you they were taking the technical question seriously. What's remarkable is how quickly that investigation started turning up things that didn't fit the Soviet hypothesis either.
And within days of that tasking, another agency entered the picture, one that most people do not immediately associate with aerial phenomena: the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Director J. Edgar Hoover received a request from the Army Air Forces to assist in the investigation of flying disc reports. Hoover agreed, with conditions. The FBI's involvement in the summer of 1947 is documented in a series of internal memos and field reports that we are going to examine in detail today. And what those documents reveal about the nature and scope of the early investigation is considerably more surprising than the official history suggests.
The FBI. I want to make sure listeners are tracking what that means. This isn't the Air Force quietly taking notes. This is the nation's domestic intelligence and law enforcement agency getting formally pulled into a UFO investigation within weeks of the first reports. That tells you something about how the threat was being framed internally.
It tells you they weren't sure if this was a foreign intelligence matter, a domestic security matter, or something else entirely. When you loop in the FBI that fast, you're covering your bases. You're saying, we don't know what this is, we don't know where it's coming from, and we need every investigative tool available. That's not the behavior of an institution that thinks it's dealing with mass hysteria. That's the behavior of an institution that thinks it might be dealing with something real and potentially dangerous.
So we've got the Army Air Forces, we've got Wright Field's engineers, and we've got the FBI, all mobilized within weeks of the first public reports. And meanwhile, the public statement is essentially nothing to see here. That tension is what we're going to spend this episode unpacking. Echo, let's start with the documents.
Before we do, one more piece of context that will make everything we examine today land harder. The season question for this entire series is there really something in the sky? We are starting in 1947 because that is where the official record starts. But I want to be clear about something. This is not history for its own sake. The patterns established in the summer of 1947, the descriptions, the flight characteristics, the institutional response, those patterns have not changed. The documents we are going to examine today were written 75 years ago. The language in them will feel uncomfortably current.
And if you want a preview of what I mean by that, we have FAA records from 2021 and 2022 that we'll be looking at later in this episode. Official incident reports from commercial airline pilots filed this decade. The descriptions in those reports are going to sound like they were written in the same room as the 1947 documents. Same shape, same speed, same behavior, same institutional response. That continuity is the story. Let's go find it.
Let us start with one of the earliest official records from that summer of 1947. This is a declassified FBI file, formally titled UFO Investigation Files Part 1, compiled by the FBI's Domestic Intelligence Division in July 1947. It is 70 pages long, and it covers the Bureau's first systematic effort to log and triage the incoming flood of flying disc reports. The FBI was not just collecting newspaper clippings. They were receiving field reports from their own agents, coordinating with Army Air Forces intelligence, and making active decisions about which cases warranted further investigation. This is the paper trail from day one.
And this is July 1947. We are talking about the same weeks that the first flying saucer headlines were hitting the newspapers. The Bureau wasn't waiting to see how things developed. They were already in the middle of it.
Correct. And on page 16 of this file, we get one of the most instructive early entries. It documents the account of a man named Dick Rankin, described in the document itself as an experienced pilot, who reported watching a formation of disks race over the Mount Baker-Shucksun area in Washington state. The file notes that Rankin, drawing on his aviation knowledge, attempted to rationalize what he had seen. He concluded, the document says, that the objects must have been the Navy's experimental XF-5U aircraft. The file then adds a single devastating detail. Only one such machine had ever been built.
Hold on. So a trained, experienced pilot sees something he can't identify, and his best explanation, the most rational thing he could reach for, was a specific experimental Navy aircraft. And the FBI's own file points out that explanation is impossible because there was only one of those planes in existence. You can't have a formation of something that only exists as a single prototype.
That detail matters more than it might seem to a civilian listener. When pilots try to identify an unknown, we don't guess randomly. We run through a mental catalog of everything we know flies. Rankin went straight to the most exotic aircraft he could think of, the XF-5U, which was a real disc-shaped experimental plane. The fact that his best identification was still impossible tells you something important. Whatever he saw didn't fit anything in the known inventory. A formation of disc-shaped objects moving in concert, fast enough to impress an experienced aviator. That's not a weather balloon.
And this is the FBI documenting this, not a newspaper. They're recording the contradiction right there in the file. Pilot says XF-5U, file notes that's impossible. They're not just collecting the sighting, they're already stress-testing the explanation.
That is exactly the right way to read it. The FBI was functioning as an early filter, taking reports in, noting when the explanations did not hold, and passing cases up the chain to Army Air Force's intelligence when they could not resolve them internally. The Rankin entry is a perfect example of that process. The explanation was offered, the explanation failed, and the case went forward unresolved.
What I find telling is that the file doesn't editorialize. It doesn't say Rankin was credible or incredible. It just records the fact and the contradiction. In my experience, that kind of flat, neutral documentation is actually a sign of serious institutional attention. When agencies start adding commentary about a witness's reliability, that's often when the politics creep in. Here, in 1947, they're just writing down what happened.
Now, page 18 of the same file gives us something quite different, and it is worth examining because it shows the other end of the Bureau's triage process. The entry describes the discovery of a physical object. On page 18, the document states, "An object in the shape of a disc, 19 inches in diameter, had been found. Might be made of a substance such as cardboard covered by a silver airplane dope material. Opinion that contraption might possibly have been made by some juvenile." This is the FBI's assessment of an actual disc they had in hand.
Okay, so they literally found a disc. Someone found an actual physical object that looked like the things being reported, round, silvery, and the FBI's conclusion was, a kid made it. That's their answer. Some juvenile built a cardboard flying saucer and threw it into a field.
Which is probably the right call on that particular object, honestly. 19 inches across, cardboard and aluminum paint. That's not what multiple trained pilots were describing, moving at hundreds of miles an hour across mountain ranges. But the fact that the FBI was physically recovering objects, examining materials, documenting dimensions, that's not the behavior of an agency that thought this was all mass hysteria. You don't measure a hoax. You measure something you're not sure about.
That distinction is important. The Bureau's conclusion on that specific object was dismissive. Juvenile construction, no further action. But the act of analysis itself tells a different story. They had a protocol. They were examining physical evidence. The dismissal of one object did not mean dismissal of the broader phenomenon. These two entries from the same file, the unresolvable pilot sighting and the examined physical disc, capture the Bureau's posture in that first summer perfectly, taking it seriously enough to investigate, uncertain enough to keep the file open.
So we've got the summer of 1947 covered. The FBI is in the room. The Army Air Forces are being looped in. Pilots are reporting things they can't explain. But I want to make sure we don't lose track of something. This wasn't just an American phenomenon. Let me take a breath here, because what we're about to look at comes from a completely different direction, and it's going to reframe the scale of what was happening.
That's the part that always strikes me when I go through these early records. You can almost understand the American military's initial instinct to think this might be Soviet technology, or some domestic experimental program nobody told them about. But when you start seeing the same descriptions coming in from completely unrelated sources, in completely different countries, from people who had no access to the American news cycle, that's when the experimental aircraft explanation starts to fall apart.
Which brings us to our second document. This is a CIA intelligence report, formally designated C05515694, dated October 23, 1949, 2 years after the initial American wave. It is a single declassified page, now unclassified, and it records an eyewitness account gathered from a source traveling by train between Leningrad and Moscow. The CIA was collecting this account because the source had observed something in Soviet airspace that they could not explain. The document is a raw intelligence report, meaning it is the field officer's write-up of what the source described, as close to the original account as the CIA's records preserve it.
So this is American intelligence gathering a UFO sighting report from inside the Soviet Union. In 1949, 2 years after Roswell, 2 years after the first wave, and the CIA has a source on a train between Leningrad and Moscow reporting something in the sky.
That is precisely the context. The document is partially degraded. This is a scanned historical record, and some of the OCR text reflects the age of the original. But the core description is clear. On page 1, it states, "We saw a bright light in the air which was attended by a long tail of dense smoke. It was much too bright for a plane. It may have been 5 to 25 miles distant and was under 2,000 feet above ground." The source then, according to the document, asked their local guide for an explanation. The guide's response is recorded on the same page. The guide replied that it was probably a flying saucer.
Wait, a Soviet local guide in 1949 telling an American intelligence source that what they just saw was probably a flying saucer. That phrase had crossed the Iron Curtain. People in the Soviet Union were using the same language, the same cultural shorthand, to describe the same kind of unexplained thing in the sky.
The description itself is what I keep coming back to. Bright light, dense smoke tail, too bright for a conventional aircraft, low altitude. That combination doesn't match any Soviet military aircraft profile I'm aware of from that era. A jet exhaust plume looks different from a dense smoke trail. A meteor burns up at much higher altitude and moves much faster. Whatever this was, it was moving slowly enough to be observed at length from a train, which rules out most of the obvious explanations right there.
The CIA's decision to collect and file this report in 1949 is itself significant. The agency was less than 2 years old at this point. The CIA was formally established in September 1947, just months after the initial American sighting wave. And already by late 1949, they had a protocol for receiving and documenting UFO-related intelligence from foreign sources. This was not an afterthought. It was built into their collection architecture from very early in the agency's existence.
So the CIA's institutional response to this phenomenon began essentially at the CIA's founding. That's not a minor detail. That's the agency deciding, within its first 2 years of existence, that this was worth tracking across borders, in denied areas behind the Iron Curtain.
And think about what that means operationally. In 1949, getting intelligence out of Soviet territory was extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. You didn't waste that kind of collection effort on something you thought was noise. If the CIA was tasking sources to report on unexplained aerial phenomena inside the USSR, someone at a senior level made the decision that this information had strategic value. That's a significant institutional commitment.
Let me just sit with that for a second. We've gone from an FBI file in Wisconsin measuring a cardboard disk to CIA intelligence from inside the Soviet Union describing a glowing object with a smoke trail that a local guide calls a flying saucer. In the space of 2 years, this thing went from a domestic curiosity to an international intelligence priority. That's a remarkable escalation.
And the escalation did not stop there. Our third document moves us forward another decade, and it shows us something important about who was observing these objects, and what their professional credentials meant for the credibility of the reports. This is CIA document C055-16056, dated December 16, 1960, now fully declassified and unclassified. It is a single-page CIA memorandum recording the eyewitness account of a physics professor who observed an anomalous aerial object over Detroit, Michigan. The witness was accompanied by students providing corroboration. The document appears to be a field report passed up through CIA channels for review.
A physics professor, someone whose entire professional training is built around observing phenomena, measuring properties, and describing what they see with precision. That's not a random member of the public looking up at the sky.
Precisely. And the description this witness provided is technically specific in ways that matter. On page 1, the document states, "Object that looked like a meteor, except that it was extremely large and almost like a disk, not like a point of light. It was a greenish light, just off-white, but green and quite visible, definitely incandescent, and of a very high temperature." The witness then speculated that the object might be a missile fragment, but the document records the description first. And the description is what the CIA preserved.
The comparison to a meteor is important here, and the fact that he immediately rejected it tells you something. A physicist knows what a meteor looks like. They know the size, the color, the duration, the trajectory. When a physicist says, "It looked like a meteor except," and then lists multiple ways it didn't behave like a meteor, that's not casual observation. He's running it through an analytical framework in real time and finding that none of his known categories fit. The disk shape, specifically, is what ruled out the meteor explanation. Meteors are points of light or streaks, not disks.
And he had students with him who saw the same thing. So this isn't a lone witness, late at night, possibly confused. This is a trained scientist with corroborating observers describing an object that doesn't match anything in his professional knowledge base, and the CIA thought it was worth documenting and filing.
The missile fragment hypothesis the professor offered is interesting in its own right. By 1960, the space age was underway. Sputnik had launched in 1957, and both the United States and Soviet Union were putting hardware into orbit and losing pieces of it. The idea that unexplained aerial objects might be re-entering debris was a rational hypothesis at that moment in history. The CIA was tracking that possibility alongside the unexplained. But a disk shape, incandescent, with defined edges, that does not describe fragmentary debris on a ballistic re-entry path.
Re-entering debris tumbles. It breaks apart. It leaves trails of fragments. What this professor described sounds stable. A defined disk shape, consistent color, consistent luminosity. That's a coherent object under some kind of controlled flight, not a piece of a rocket breaking up in the atmosphere. His instinct to offer the missile explanation was reasonable for 1960. His description, though, doesn't support it.
You know what strikes me, stepping back for a moment? We've now looked at 3 documents spanning 1947 to 1960. And in every single case, the witness, whether it's an experienced pilot, an intelligence source on a Soviet train, or a physics professor, starts by reaching for a conventional explanation. Rankin says XF5U, the Soviet source asks the guide. The professor says missile fragment, and in every case, the conventional explanation doesn't hold. That pattern, across 13 years and 3 continents, is not nothing.
That's exactly the pattern I recognized from my own experience and from talking to other pilots who've had encounters. The first instinct is always to normalize it. Find the known thing it resembles most. It's only when you've exhausted every known explanation that you're left with the uncomfortable remainder. And these witnesses, all of them, were clearly doing that work in good faith. They weren't trying to see something extraordinary. They were trying to explain it away, and they couldn't.
That pattern of attempted normalization, followed by failure of explanation, runs through the documentary record consistently, and it does not end in 1960. Our fourth document brings us all the way forward to February 21st, 2021, 74 years after that first FBI file. This is an FAA Skywatch Incident Report, formally designated 237 UAP 01046, filed by the FAA Operations Center after receiving a report from a commercial airline pilot. The FAA's Skywatch program is the agency's current formal mechanism for collecting and logging UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, reports from commercial aviation. This document is now part of the National Archives UAP Records Collection, released under FOIA.
So this is the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, the people who run American airspace, maintaining an active reporting system for UFOs in 2021. Not the Air Force, not some special program. The agency that manages commercial flight, treating this as a routine enough occurrence to have a dedicated reporting channel.
That is correct, and the report is written in the compressed operational language of air traffic control, which is itself worth noting, because it means the pilot's report went through standard aviation reporting channels, not a special hotline. On page 1, the document states, 1918 PIC reported UFO at FL360 while WB TAD 1800 30. It was described as a long cylindrical object that was EB and went over the top of the aircraft. UFO Reporting Center notified. To translate, at 7:18 p.m., the pilot in command reported a UFO at flight level 360, that is, 36,000 feet. The object was described as long and cylindrical, traveling eastbound, and it passed directly over the top of the aircraft. The FAA then notified the UFO Reporting Center.
Okay, let me make sure I've got this right. A commercial airline pilot, the pilot in command, meaning the captain, the most senior and experienced person on that aircraft, is at 36,000 feet, which is standard cruising altitude, and a long cylindrical object passes over the top of their plane. And the FAA's response is to notify the UFO Reporting Center. There is a UFO Reporting Center. That exists, and it got a phone call about this.
FL360 is a controlled airspace environment. At that altitude, you know exactly what should be around you. You're in contact with air traffic control. You have TCAS, which is the Traffic Collision Avoidance System, alerting you to other aircraft. If something passes over the top of your aircraft at that altitude, and you can see it, it is either very close or very large. The fact that the pilot filed a formal report through official channels rather than just logging it informally tells you this was not a routine observation. Pilots do not file paperwork for things they can explain.
And the shape, long and cylindrical. That's different from the disk descriptions we've been hearing from 1947 and 1949 and 1960. Same pattern of inexplicability, same trained observer, same formal government documentation, but a different shape. Which raises a question I want to come back to. Are we talking about one phenomenon or several?
That is a question the documents themselves raise repeatedly, and it is one we will return to across this series. What this 2021 FAA record establishes, in combination with what we have examined from 1947 through 1960, is the continuity of the official response. The institutional machinery, the formal reporting, the interagency notification, the archival documentation, has been running without interruption for more than 70 years. The language changes, the agencies involved shift, the classification levels vary, but the underlying behavior, trained observers reporting anomalous objects, official channels receiving and preserving those reports, has been constant.
What I want listeners to understand is what it costs a pilot to file a report like this. Even today, there's a professional stigma attached. You're a captain for a major commercial carrier, you've spent decades building a reputation for sound judgment, and you're about to put your name on a document that says you saw an unidentified flying object. You do that because you have an obligation to report hazards to navigation. You do that because something genuinely happened that you cannot explain. You do not do it casually. The fact that these reports exist across every era is itself a form of evidence about the seriousness of the observations.
And there are hundreds of them in the FAA's Skywatch files alone. We're looking at one from 2021, but this is a system that has been collecting reports from commercial pilots for years, and the National Archives has now released a significant portion of that collection. The volume alone is striking, but here's what I keep coming back to as we work through these documents. We've been looking at reports, observations, what pilots and witnesses and sources described seeing. What we haven't yet looked at is what the government actually did about it. Not just filed the report, but investigated, analyzed, and in some cases physically responded.
That is precisely where the next set of documents takes us. Because there is a document in the FBI's early files, one we have not yet examined, that changes the picture significantly. The question so far has been whether the government took these reports seriously. What we are about to find out is that seriously may be an understatement.
Okay, so we've been building this picture across the first half of the documents section. The 1947 wave, the FBI getting pulled in almost immediately, the CIA quietly translating foreign reports. And what keeps emerging is this consistent description: objects moving at speeds and performing maneuvers that the technology of the era simply cannot explain. But here's what I want to push on now, because you might be thinking, okay, that's the 1940s and 50s. Radar was primitive, pilots were nervous, the Cold War had everyone on edge. Maybe there's a rational explanation rooted in that specific historical moment. So let's look at what's still happening. Right now, in modern airspace, with modern instruments, with pilots who've logged tens of thousands of hours.
That is exactly the right question to ask. And the FAA's own Skywatch reporting system, which is the formal channel commercial and general aviation pilots use to file reports of unidentified aerial phenomena, has been producing records that are publicly available through FOIA requests. These are not anonymous hotline calls. These are official incident reports filed by credentialed aviation professionals, forwarded through air traffic control, and logged by the federal agency that oversees all civilian airspace in the United States. The document we are looking at now is one of those reports. This is FAA Skywatch Incident Report 237U APO0067, filed August 30th, 2021, one page. The aircraft was a commercial flight on departure, climbing through 11,500 feet, approximately 15 nautical miles north of Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport, one of the busiest commercial airspace corridors in the country. The report states, on page 1, aircraft reported an unidentified aerial phenomenon off the left side while on departure at 11,500 feet, 15 nmn of FLL. The unknown phenomenon shot straight up from the ground past the plane.
Shot straight up from the ground past the plane, past it. So this thing started at ground level, 0 feet, and traveled upward through 11,500 feet of airspace, past a departing commercial aircraft, fast enough that the pilot clocked it going by. That's not a drone that drifted into restricted airspace. That's not a weather balloon. I don't know what that is, but it's not any of the explanations I'd reach for first.
The thing that stands out to me in that report is the phrase, shot straight up. That's not a description pilots use casually. When you're climbing out of a busy airport like Fort Lauderdale, you are heads down focused. You're managing your climb rate, your heading, your communications with departure control. For a pilot to break from that workload and file an official FAA report means whatever they saw was significant enough to demand attention. And the vertical trajectory is the detail that matters most to me. Conventional aircraft don't do that. Rockets do that. But a rocket launched 15 nautical miles north of Fort Lauderdale would have generated a very different kind of response.
The significance of the vertical maneuver as a data point becomes clearer when you consider it alongside the other performance characteristics that appear repeatedly across these FAA reports. Stationary hovering, sudden acceleration, no visible propulsion, no lights, and now instantaneous vertical ascent from ground level to above 11,000 feet. Each report, taken alone, can be explained away. Taken together, they describe a consistent performance envelope that does not match any known aircraft category, commercial, military, or experimental.
And this is Fort Lauderdale Airspace in 2021. This isn't a remote radar installation in the Nevada desert in 1952. There are air traffic controllers tracking every transponder in that corridor. There are other aircraft. There are instruments everywhere. If something shot straight up through 11,000 feet of airspace in one of the busiest departure corridors in the southeast United States, and the best the FAA can do is mark the case closed with no further action, that tells you something about how these reports are being handled.
That's the part that bothers me, honestly. The reporting system exists. Pilots are using it. The data is being collected. But closed, no further action is the outcome on almost every one of these. In my experience, when something happens in controlled airspace that you cannot identify, the investigation doesn't end. It escalates. You pull radar data, you cross-reference other traffic in the sector, you talk to other pilots on frequency. The fact that these cases are being closed without that process tells me the institutional will to actually resolve them isn't there.
Let's go to the next one, because I want to see if the pattern holds across different aircraft types and different contexts.
This is FAA Skywatch Incident Report 237UAP0003, filed August 31, 2007. The aircraft is a Mitsubishi MU-2, call sign RUF-442. That is a twin-engine turboprop, a smaller commuter-class aircraft. The pilot was at 13,000 feet, 45 nautical miles south-southwest of the Dreyer VOR, a navigational waypoint. The report states, on page 1, RUF-442 at 13,000 feet reported a UFO above him, 45 Enier SSW of Dreyer VOR. Pick observed a bright white light that is not moving, but is following his flight. The notation PIC means pilot in command, the captain of the aircraft.
So we have a pilot, the captain, not a passenger, not a flight attendant, reporting a bright white light that is stationary in the sky, but is somehow also following his aircraft. Those two things feel like they should be mutually exclusive. If it's not moving, how is it following him? And if it's following him, how is it not moving? Help me understand what the pilot is actually describing here.
What the pilot is most likely describing is an object that appears stationary relative to the ground. It's not flying in the way aircraft fly, with a heading and airspeed, but it is maintaining a fixed position relative to the aircraft. So, from the pilot's perspective, wherever he turns, wherever he looks, this thing is still there, above him, holding position. That behavior is consistent with what other pilots have described in cases going back decades. It's not following in the sense of chasing, it's pacing. And that is a genuinely unusual behavior for any object in the sky.
What I find significant about this 2007 report is the final notation. The case was closed and the information was forwarded to the National UFO Reporting Center. That is a civilian organization. It is not a military or intelligence agency. It is not the Air Force. It is not NORAD. For a federal aviation authority to formally close an incident involving a commercial pilot's observation of an unidentified object in controlled airspace and then route the record to a civilian nonprofit, that tells you something about where these reports were going in 2007, which is essentially nowhere.
Okay, I need a second here, because we're now looking at 15+ years of these FAA Skywatch reports, 2007, 2021, 2022, and the response from the government is the same every single time. Pilot reports object, FAA logs it, case closed, information forwarded somewhere that can't do anything with it. Meanwhile, these pilots are describing things that their entire professional training tells them should not be there. And we're just filing it away.
That's been the frustration for a long time among pilots who've had these experiences. You're a professional. You've got a medical certificate, a type rating, thousands of hours. You file the report because that's what you're supposed to do. And then nothing happens. The system is designed, whether intentionally or not, to absorb these reports without acting on them. After a while, pilots stop filing. Why would you go through the paperwork and the risk to your professional reputation if the answer is always, case closed, no further action? The reporting system becomes a black hole.
The next document addresses a different aspect of the performance envelope. This is FAA Skywatch Incident Report 237 UAP 00094, filed July 28, 2022. The aircraft is a Delta Airlines Airbus A321, call sign DAL2230. They were westbound at flight level 340, that is 34,000 feet, 35 miles southeast of LBF, which is North Platte, Nebraska. The report states on page 1, aircraft reported an unidentified aerial phenomenon off the 12 o'clock while W bound at FL 340, 35 miles SE of LBF. The unknown phenomenon was stationary and untethered with no lights. Unknown color or size as it passed underneath of the aircraft.
12 o'clock means directly in front of them. So this is a Delta A321 at 34,000 feet, cruising westbound, and there is something stationary in the sky directly ahead of them with no lights, no tether, unknown size and color. And it passes underneath the aircraft, at 34,000 feet, in the middle of Nebraska. What is stationary at 34,000 feet with no lights? That altitude rules out almost every drone I know of. Weather balloons drift. They don't hold position. I genuinely don't know what that is.
At FL 340, you're in Class A airspace. Everything up there requires a transponder, a clearance, and active communication with ATC. Something stationary at that altitude with no lights and no transponder. Because if it had a transponder, ATC would have identified it immediately. Is not supposed to exist. Full stop. The fact that it passed underneath the aircraft means the crew had visual contact long enough to track its relative motion. They watched it go from 12 o'clock to underneath them. That's not a momentary flash or a trick of light. That's a sustained observation of a real, physical object.
The descriptor untethered in the official report language is significant. It is the FAA's way of ruling out the most common mundane explanation for high-altitude stationary objects, weather balloons and research balloons, which are tethered or free-floating, but follow predictable drift patterns based on wind. The report is specifically noting that this object was not tethered, and by extension, not behaving as a balloon would behave. It was holding position at 34,000 feet in a manner that has no conventional explanation on record.
And the case is closed. No further action.
No further action.
I want to sit with what we've established in just these FAA reports for a moment. We have pilots describing objects that shoot vertically from the ground through 11,000 feet. Objects that are stationary but appear to track aircraft. Objects at 34,000 feet with no lights, no transponder, no tether, passing underneath commercial airliners. And the institutional response in every single case is to close the file. That's not a scientific investigation. That's a filing system.
You know what it reminds me of? The early Project Blue Book era, when the Air Force was processing hundreds of reports and the mandate wasn't to understand what was happening. It was to explain it away and close the file. Same structure, different decade. The form has changed. The outcome hasn't.
That parallel is not coincidental, and the final document in this section makes that connection explicit in a way that is difficult to dismiss. This is CIA document C05517744. The date is unclear. The document is partially garbled, which is itself a significant detail we will return to. It is one page. It appears to be a summary or analysis document related to a UFO study, and it addresses the question of performance characteristics directly. On page 1, it states, "The observers can establish the speed and acceleration of the UFO, which cannot be achieved by any aircraft."
That sentence, written by the CIA in an official document, is saying that the objects being reported were performing maneuvers that no aircraft could perform. Not we cannot identify the aircraft, not the witnesses may have been mistaken. The CIA is saying the speed and acceleration of these objects exceeds what any aircraft is capable of. That's an extraordinary admission to find in a government document.
The document is heavily garbled, which means portions of the text are corrupted or illegible, likely due to the age of the original document and the condition in which it was preserved or digitized. That limitation is real, and I want to be transparent about it. What is legible, and what is clearly stated on page 1, is that CIA analysts were receiving observer measurements of UFO speeds and accelerations and concluding formally that those performance parameters could not be achieved by any known aircraft. The document also references aviation authorities and notes increased sightings, though the specific context of those references is partially obscured.
What strikes me about that CIA document is the phrase, "the observers can establish." That's not dismissive language. That's not "the observers claimed" or "the observers believed." The word establish implies that the measurements were credible enough that the CIA analysts accepted them as a valid data point. They're not questioning the witnesses. They're accepting the measurements and then drawing the conclusion that the performance envelope exceeds known aircraft. That is a fundamentally different posture than what the public was being told.
And this is the CIA we're talking about, an agency that was, at that same period, running some of the most sophisticated aerial reconnaissance programs in the history of aviation, U-2, SR-71, programs that were so classified that pilots were being told to lie about them if they were ever asked. The CIA knew exactly what the cutting edge of aircraft performance looked like, and they were still writing documents saying these objects exceed what any aircraft can achieve.
That context is essential. The CIA's Technical Intelligence Division in the late 1940s and 1950s was tracking Soviet aviation development with extreme precision. They had detailed performance data on the most advanced aircraft in the world, including their own classified programs. When a CIA document states that observed UFO performance cannot be achieved by any aircraft, that statement is being made by analysts who have access to the complete picture of what aircraft, including classified aircraft, are capable of. It is not an uninformed observation.
So we've now walked through documents from 2007, 2021, 2022, modern FAA reports from credentialed commercial pilots, and a CIA analysis that could be from almost any decade in the post-war era, all describing the same core phenomenon. Objects that don't behave like aircraft. Objects that hover, that accelerate beyond known limits, that shoot vertically through controlled airspace. And across all of it, the institutional response is the same. File it, close it, move on.
That consistency across time is what gets me. If this were a technology problem, if these were experimental aircraft that we just hadn't identified yet, you'd expect the reports to change as technology advanced. You'd expect the performance gap to close. Instead, across 75 years of reports, the objects are always faster, always more maneuverable, always doing things that the best aircraft of that era cannot do. The gap doesn't close. If anything, it stays constant. And that's a very strange thing.
Okay, we've built a lot of ground here. We started today with a Soviet pilot's description from the 1940s, moved through FBI involvement in the first days of the 1947 wave, looked at CIA intelligence reports, and now we've traced the same phenomenon through modern FAA records into 2022. And the picture that emerges is one of a consistent, documented, officially recorded phenomenon that has been observed by credentialed professionals across 8 decades. I thought I understood where this episode was going. But Echo, I get the sense you've been holding something back.
There is one more document, and it changes the frame around everything we have discussed today. Not because it describes a new sighting or a more dramatic performance characteristic, but because of what it reveals about the government's posture from the very first moment this phenomenon became public. We have been discussing the 1947 wave as if the government's response was to observe, to log, to study from a distance. This document shows that is not the full picture.
All right, what is it?
This is a document from the FBI's internal UFO investigation files. It is part 1 of the FBI's declassified UFO records, the earliest layer of the Bureau's involvement in what was then being called the flying disc phenomenon. This document dates to the summer of 1947, which means we are now going back to the very beginning, the same weeks we opened this episode with. the same weeks when the first wave of reports was breaking across the country. And what this document reveals is that the FBI was not simply receiving reports and passing them along. They were conducting a hands-on physical investigation.
Wait, a physical investigation? As in, they had something in their hands?
The document details the discovery and analysis of what witnesses described as a flying disc. FBI agents were dispatched. The object was examined. This was not a file of witness statements. This was field work. The Bureau was physically investigating a recovered object within the first weeks of the 1947 flap, before Project Sign, before Project Grudge, before any of the official Air Force investigation programs that we were told represented the government's formal response to the phenomenon.
That's significant in a way that I don't think is immediately obvious. The Air Force programs, Sign, Grudge, Blue Book, those were the official, acknowledged investigation efforts. They had a paper trail, a public face, a congressional mandate. The FBI operating in parallel, conducting physical investigations in the same time frame, suggests that the government's response to the 1947 wave was not a single coordinated program. It was multiple agencies moving simultaneously, each doing their own work. And those investigations were not being coordinated in any way that was transparent to the public.
So let me get this straight. The public story in the summer of 1947 was, some civilians saw strange things in the sky. The Air Force is looking into it. Don't worry. The actual story, as documented in FBI records, is the FBI had agents in the field examining physical objects within days of the first reports. That's not the same story. Those are two completely different levels of government response.
That is the precise distinction. The public posture and the operational reality diverged from the very first days of the phenomenon becoming public. The FBI's involvement, physical, immediate, hands-on, was not disclosed. The Air Force's investigation programs were at least acknowledged, even if their conclusions were managed. But a separate federal law enforcement agency conducting field investigations of recovered objects in the summer of 1947 was not part of the story that Americans were told. This document establishes that the gap between the public narrative and the classified record opened not gradually, over years, but immediately. From day one.
I want to add something here, because this matters from an operational standpoint. When multiple agencies are simultaneously investigating the same phenomenon without coordinating their findings, the FBI doing field work, the Air Force running its own programs, the CIA conducting its own analysis, what you end up with is a fractured picture. Each agency has a piece. No single agency has the whole thing. And that fragmentation, whether it was intentional or a product of normal bureaucratic competition, has the same practical effect as a deliberate cover-up. Nobody outside those agencies ever gets to see the complete picture.
And here's what that means for everything we've looked at today. We started this episode with a Soviet pilot's description from the 1940s, a shining disc flying at tremendous speed. We looked at the FBI getting pulled into the investigation almost immediately. We tracked CIA intelligence reporting across decades. We looked at modern FAA records from professional pilots describing the same performance characteristics. And now we find out that the physical investigation, the hands-on field-level response, was happening in parallel with all of that, and was never disclosed. The question isn't just what these objects are. The question is, how much of what was found has never been made public?
That question cannot be answered from the documents currently available. What can be established from the record is this. The government's response to the 1947 wave was immediate, serious, multi-agency, and only partially disclosed. The FBI document proves physical investigation was underway from the first days. The CIA documents prove analytical work was being done in parallel. The Air Force programs prove there was an official, institutional framework for collecting reports. And the FAA records we examined today prove that the reporting and the closing of files without resolution has continued, uninterrupted, for 75 years.
What I keep coming back to is the consistency. Not just in the descriptions, the speed, the acceleration, the hovering, the vertical maneuvers, but in the institutional response. Every era, every agency, every decade, collect the report, close the file, move on. That consistency either means there is a deliberate policy of non-resolution, or it means nobody has ever been given the authority and the resources to actually resolve it. Either way, after 75 years, we don't have an answer. And that itself is a finding.
That's a hell of a place to be at the end of our first episode. We came in asking, when did this begin, and how seriously did the government take it from day one? The answer from the documents is, it began in the summer of 1947, and the government took it seriously enough to have the FBI conducting field investigations of physical objects within the first weeks. Seriously enough for the CIA to formally conclude that the performance of these objects exceeded anything any aircraft could achieve. Seriously enough to build an entire institutional reporting infrastructure that has been collecting and closing files for 7 decades.
These early sightings, the Soviet pilot, the 1947 wave, the individual observers in remote skies, established the core pattern. The descriptions, the performance characteristics, the institutional response. But they were, for the most part, isolated reports, single observers, small aircraft, remote locations. The phenomenon had been documented, but it had not yet been undeniable in the way that forces a public reckoning.
But that was about to change. Because what happens when it's not one pilot in a remote corridor? What happens when a whole formation of these objects appears over the most symbolically significant city in the United States, not once, but on multiple nights, witnessed by thousands of people on the ground and tracked simultaneously by multiple military radar installations? That's not a file you can close. That's not a case you can forward to the National UFO Reporting Center and move on. Next time, we go to Washington, D.C., the summer of 1952, and the night the skies over the Capitol became impossible to explain away. Okay, let me just sit with this for a second, because I think we need to step back from the individual documents and look at what we actually have here. We started this episode in the summer of 1947. A wave of sightings breaks across the country. The press is calling them flying saucers. The public thinks it's a curiosity, maybe a fad. And what we've shown today is that behind closed doors, the government response was not skeptical. It was not dismissive. It was immediate, serious, and hands-on. The FBI was physically analyzing recovered material within days. The Air Force was logging pilot testimony with the same rigor they'd apply to a combat incident report. The CIA was translating foreign press accounts and filing them as intelligence. That is not how you respond to a weather balloon story.
What strikes me, and I've thought about this a lot over the years, is the caliber of the witnesses from the very beginning. You're not talking about civilians who saw something strange through a car window. You're talking about military pilots, commercial aviators, law enforcement, people who spend their professional lives identifying aircraft, reading the sky, making split-second assessments. When a pilot files a report, they are putting their name and their professional credibility on the line. Nobody does that lightly. The fact that these reports kept coming in, from people like that, in 1947 and in 2024, tells you something real is being observed.
The paper trail tells a specific story. In 1947, the FBI received physical evidence and opened an active investigation. The CIA was simultaneously collecting and translating international reports, treating the phenomenon as a foreign intelligence concern. The Air Force was logging sightings from credentialed observers with precise technical detail, speeds, altitudes, maneuvers. And then, decades later, the FAA is issuing official Skywatch incident reports every time a commercial pilot reports an unidentified object, using the same structured language, the same credentialing of the observer, the same careful documentation. The bureaucratic response has not changed in 75 years. That consistency is itself a data point.
And here's what gets me, honestly. What gets me is the gap between what these documents show and what most people walking around today believe. Most people think UFOs are a fringe topic, something for conspiracy theorists. something the government looked at once, decided was nonsense, and moved on. But that's not what the documents say. The documents say the government never stopped looking. They never stopped filing reports, never stopped classifying material, never stopped sending analysts to evaluate physical evidence. There's a word for that kind of sustained institutional attention, and it isn't dismissal.
I'll tell you what bothers me most as a pilot. It's the flight characteristics. Every era, every decade, the descriptions are the same. No visible propulsion, no control surfaces, speeds and maneuvers that don't match anything in any inventory I'm aware of. In my career, I flew everything from trainers to fast movers. I know what aircraft look like at altitude, at speed, in turns. What these witnesses are describing, from 1947 straight through to those FAA reports from last year, does not match any performance envelope I've ever been trained on. And I've been trained on a lot of them.
There is one more thing worth naming directly. The FBI document we examined, the one detailing hands-on analysis of physical material in the very first week of the 1947 flap, that document was not released voluntarily. It came out through the Freedom of Information Act, decades later, buried in a batch of files. The public was not told at the time that federal investigators were physically examining objects associated with these reports. The official posture was curiosity and skepticism. The classified record tells a different story. That gap between the public posture and the internal record is not a footnote. It is the story.
So we have 1947 to 2024, 77 years of documented sightings from professional observers, filed through official channels, analyzed by government agencies. And the phenomenon in those reports is remarkably consistent: round or disc-like, high speed, no visible propulsion, capable of maneuvers that defy conventional aerodynamics. Whatever this is, it has been showing up in our skies for 3/4 of a century. And the people whose job it is to know what's in the airspace cannot explain it. That should be a much bigger story than it is.
What comes next in this series takes everything we have established today and raises the stakes considerably. The sightings we examined were largely isolated, individual pilots, single observers, remote locations. But in the summer of 1952, the phenomenon did not appear over a quiet stretch of ocean or an empty mountain range. It appeared over Washington, D.C. repeatedly, multiple nights, and it was not seen by one pilot. It was tracked on radar by 3 separate facilities simultaneously: Andrews Air Force Base, Washington National Airport, and Bolling Air Force Base, while airline pilots reported visual contact at the same locations at the same times.
You're telling me this happened over the Capitol, over the White House?
Over restricted airspace that included the White House, the Capitol, and the Pentagon. Jet interceptors were scrambled. The objects were tracked at speeds that the Air Force's own radar operators calculated at over 7,000 miles per hour. When the jets arrived, the objects vanished. When the jets departed, the objects returned. This went on for 2 consecutive weekends in July 1952. It generated front-page headlines around the world and forced the Air Force to hold what was, at the time, the largest Pentagon press conference since the end of World War II. And the documents from that event, what the radar operators actually recorded, what the pilots actually reported, what the Air Force actually concluded in the classified files versus what they said publicly, tell completely different stories.
So everything we've built today, the credentialed witnesses, the official documentation, the gap between the public record and the classified record, all of that is about to get stress tested against the single most dramatic UFO event in American history. An event that happened not over the Pacific, not over a military test range, but directly over the seat of American government, watched by thousands of people, tracked by military radar, and scrambled against by the United States Air Force. That's next time.
These early sightings established a pattern: strange, high-speed objects, consistent descriptions, credentialed observers, official documentation that was never meant to be public. But those were lone observers in remote skies. What happens when a whole squadron of them appears over the nation's capital, witnessed by thousands and tracked on military radar? Next time, the invasion of Washington, D.C.